And the fourth answer that can be given is probably the simplest, but I think a bit superficial. And so probably not as, won't give you as deep an appreciation for what philosophy is and how it relates to other fields as the first three. But the fourth possible answer is that, well, philosophy is concerned with specific subject matter. So there's a specific set of questions that are definitively philosophical questions. And these include questions like, what can we know? Can we know anything for certain? What's the foundation of knowledge? What's the definition of knowledge? What is real? What should we do? What's the best way to live? These are questions in fields that go by names like epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and so on. On this slide, I've given you a list of some of the recognized subfields of philosophy. If you look at, for instance, UNLV's course catalog in philosophy, you'll see that many courses have names like this. And if you go to if you search titles of philosophy books, you'll see that many titles have these words in the titles. These are recognized areas of the contemporary field known as philosophy. So they include, I've sort of broken them into two categories: the core subfields of philosophy and the non-core subfields. Okay, the core fields, you'll notice, all have to do with really fundamental questions that again, it seems like there is no other discipline that is adequate to address. And so these include epistemology. The word episteme comes from the Greek. It means knowledge. Epistemology is basically the study of knowledge or the theory of knowledge. This discipline addresses questions like, what can we know? Is there a limit to what we can know? What counts as knowledge? What should be the criteria of knowledge? Metaphysics, the history of that word is a bit complicated. We'll come back to it later, but basically this field has to do with questions of the nature of reality or existence. So what does it take for something to exist? What's the definition of existence? What kinds of things exist and what kinds of things don't exist? What is the basic structure of reality? Is reality fundamentally composed of one kind of thing, or is it composed of multiple things? Maybe it's not composed of anything at all. Composition isn't the right way to think about what reality is. So there are a lot of very big controversial questions there in metaphysics. One of the kind of most obvious questions there is, if you think about mental things, like you think about thoughts and emotions, you can ask, are thoughts and emotions themselves physical things? Are they the same kind of thing as physical objects like tables and chairs? Or are thoughts and emotions somehow something non-physical? Are they a different kind of thing from physical things? And so some people say, no, obviously thoughts and emotions are just states of the brain, and then states of the brain are physical things, so thoughts and emotions are physical. Other people say, well, we have correlations between thoughts and emotions and states of the brain, but we don't know exactly that the things are identical. And if you think about what your experience is when you feel an emotion like love or anger or whatever, it seems like a very different kind of existence that characterizes that feeling than the kind of existence that characterizes tables, chairs, and other physical objects. And in some ways, all that we know about even tables, chairs, and physical objects comes to us through our perception and our thoughts and our emotions. So how can we say that the physical things are the fundamental kind of reality and that our own experiences are a kind of illusion, they're ultimately just really physical? That would be a mistake. So I'm giving you two different kinds of positions within on this particular metaphysical topic, just to give you a sense of what metaphysics is about. One of the things that it's about, one of the kinds of arguments that shows up in that field. Ethics deals with questions about right and wrong, what would be better or worse ways to behave. Is there any kind of standard of morality, and what is the standard of morality if there is one? What are the fundamental principles of moral behavior? And then logic deals with basically principles of argumentation and evidence. So what kinds of evidence is good evidence for what kinds of conclusions, what kinds of arguments are successful and unsuccessful, how are arguments structured. We're going to talk more about arguments very soon in the course. We'll get to that. That's kind of one of the main tools that philosophy uses, so we will need to focus on that quite a bit. And then I've also given you a list of non-core fields, and you'll notice that the non-core fields tend to be philosophy of X fields. That is, these are all fields that deal with questions that arise regarding some subject matter, often a subject matter that's also studied by another discipline. But these fields address the questions that are kind of left over, that are maybe questions about fundamental principles or synoptic questions or evaluative questions that aren't addressed directly by that other field. So we have, for instance, philosophy of mind, which will address a lot of the same topics as psychology, but is going to do it addressing things more about fundamental principles, synoptic questions, evaluative questions. Likewise, philosophy of science, philosophy of art. One of the big questions in philosophy of science, for instance, is what is science? Is there a difference between science and non-science? Why do people, if we want to classify astronomy as a science, but astrology as not a science, why do we do that? What is it that distinguishes science from non-science? Now, if you think about it, that's not a question that science itself can answer by scientific means. It's not like there are experiments that can be done to determine the difference between science and non-science, right? So it's a question that's going to require some reflection. It's a question that in some sense, at least partly, stands outside of science itself, but can be asked about science. And likewise about art, the definition of art. What is art? What is not art? Is there any kind of standard of good art and bad art? Likewise about science, what should be the standard of good science and bad science in general? And so on for these other fields. So I don't need to give you, obviously, an overview of every philosophical question that can be asked about everything, but I just want to give you a sense of where the contemporary field is and what kinds of questions and topics are of concern to professional philosophers and in contemporary philosophy. Now, I've told this story as a story that begins with the ancient Greeks and then continues through Europe and the Arabic world on into the present day, the contemporary moment. And that means that I've told the story basically as a story of philosophy in the Western tradition. Does that mean that philosophy has only been conducted in the Western tradition, that philosophy has only been conducted in Greece and Europe and Arabia and, no, it definitely doesn't mean that. Philosophy has been conducted all over the world pretty much any time there were people who reflected on things, who engaged in the kind of reflection that we've characterized in these ways as about fundamental principles, about sort of the general overview of things, more synoptic or general or evaluative. And there are good instances of this that are available in famous texts like Confucius's Analects or Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching in China, and many hundreds of years of commentaries on those texts and innovations and new approaches and proposals for ways to think about things in the Chinese tradition. In the Indian tradition, there's a very elaborate and well-documented set of philosophical discussions beginning in even earlier than the Greek discussions, really 600 BC and before. In the Upanishads, this is recorded. These philosophical discussions about the nature of reality and the relationship between the human mind and the cosmos. And likewise, in Africa, there have been philosophers and philosophical reflection, both in kind of pre-modern tribal contexts. Certainly there was philosophy of some kind in ancient Egypt. And in the contemporary world associated with sometimes African independence movements, and kind of reflection on the experience of colonialism and slavery. And there's also been philosophy in Latin America and in what might broadly be called indigenous America, including both North and South America and Central America, and so on. So again, pretty much wherever there were people, there has been philosophy, and you can learn more about these different non-Western traditions by Googling some of the names on this slide, or following some of these links. I just want to give you a little bit of background because we're going to focus on the Western tradition, but I definitely didn't want you to think that there isn't stuff outside of that tradition that is worth looking at, and give you a little bit of a way into looking at it if you are interested. And likewise, most of the texts that we'll read, not all, but most of the texts that we'll read were written by men in the Western tradition. And this might, lead someone to wonder, wait, is philosophy just written by men? Of course not. We read writings by individual thinkers in philosophy because a lot of philosophy involves doing a lot of hard thinking and reflection as an individual. And some of our best accounts of philosophy are the kind of detailed accounts of the thinking of an individual, or of an individual in dialogue with others. And so we end up kind of looking closely at specific individuals and their writings in philosophy, kind of like you would in a literature class. You usually read a novel written by a single author, or a few novels written by a single author, and then a novel or a few novels written by other authors. Likewise, in philosophy, we read texts that are written by single authors often. And because of the history of Western civilization being mostly patriarchal, most of the people that have been able to produce that kind of single authored written work have been men. And so it's fairly obvious why most of the ancient Greek philosophers were men, and most of the philosophers in Europe were men, and so on. But obviously that's no indication that women can't do philosophy or haven't done philosophy, and there are many cases of women philosophers in the history of the world, and I've listed some of the most famous ones here. The image on this screen is of the first female philosopher listed there, Gargi, whose dialogues with other philosophers are recorded in the Upanishads, again about 2,600, maybe more, years ago. And was very well respected. She was a very well respected discussant of these fundamental issues with the people she discussed with. And then I've listed some other names here. We will read a little bit from one of these authors, Marjorie Green, a 20th century female philosopher, later in the course. But the others you can look up if you are interested. There are just so many female philosophers in the 20th century. Because obviously that's a time when women start to have more opportunity to cultivate that kind of reflection and writing that is that's sort of a prerequisite of producing philosophy, written philosophy anyway, that we could read and respond to and think about. So once women start to have more of those opportunities, there's just an eruption of writings by women philosophers. And some of these writings of the authors on this screen have to do with gender issues, but some of them don't. Some of these authors really wrote a lot about the male-female distinction and or relation and what it means to be a woman or a woman in philosophy. Some of them didn't write about that at all, and they focused on basically the same kinds of philosophical issues that the men that we will read, the men we read in the course were focused on. So anyway, just wanted to let you know that this stuff is out there. If you're interested in it, you can pursue any of these things. I'm also happy to discuss or answer questions about any of these figures if you like. If you get interested in any of them or want more information about anyone, feel free to send me an email. Okay, so with that, that's it for these introductory lectures on what philosophy is. and we'll pick up again next time.